It was a name pulled from the annals of history, Lagertha. The name alone carried weight, evoking images of strength and resilience. But this was no mythic figure from the sagas. This was a real woman, living in our modern world, whose life would be cut short in a way that no one could have predicted. The events leading up to her death, however, would leave a community reeling and searching for answers. On a quiet street, in a small town far removed from the battles of the past, a discovery would be made that would draw parallels to a darker side of human nature. Lagertha's story is not one of ancient warfare, but of a different kind of battle, a struggle between truth and deception, one that would end in unimaginable loss. Lagertha was known in her community as a person who stood tall through challenges, someone who carried with her the strength of her namesake. Friends and neighbors recall her as kind and thoughtful, but also private, keeping much of her life behind closed doors. Few could have imagined the events that would unfold on that fateful night. Few could have foreseen the terror that would follow her final days. But beneath the surface, there were tensions and events taking shape that would soon disrupt the peace of this small town. For behind Lagertha's calm exterior, there was a different story, one filled with fear, with unanswered questions, and ultimately, with violence. This is the story of Lagertha, a woman whose life intersected with something far darker than anyone could have ever anticipated. In the early hours of January 15, 2018, police were dispatched to a modest home in a small neighborhood outside of Oslo, Norway. The call came from a frantic neighbor who reported hearing strange noises from the house next door, what she described as a single loud scream followed by eerie silence. When police arrived, the scene inside the house would leave an indelible mark not just on the officers, but on an entire community that would struggle to comprehend what had occurred. Inside the house, investigators would find a scene that defied understanding. Lagertha, a 38-year-old mother of two, lay on the living room floor, her body lifeless and cold to the touch. The initial observations pointed to no signs of forced entry, and yet the violent nature of her death was undeniable. Her injuries, numerous and brutal, indicated that she had fought for her life in the final moments. However, there were no obvious clues, no weapon left behind, no clear fingerprints. There was little evidence pointing to a clear motive, and even fewer clues to the identity of the person responsible. What they did find, however, was a woman whose last moments had been filled with violence and terror. Lagertha's children, who were away that night, would return to a home forever changed. The question on everyone's mind was simple: who could have done this, and why? Lagertha's neighbors were shocked when the news broke. Many of them described her as a devoted mother, a kind neighbor, and someone who kept to herself, rarely inviting trouble. The small community, which had always felt safe, now found itself at the center of a murder investigation that seemed to raise more questions than it answered. What had led to this tragedy? Was Lagertha the victim of a random act of violence, or was this something far more personal? As detectives began their investigation, they were faced with the daunting task of piecing together the events of that night. Was Lagertha targeted? And if so, by whom? With few leads and even fewer answers, the investigation would begin to explore not only the crime itself, but also the life Lagertha had lived up until that final fateful night. Lagertha's life, at first glance, was the portrait of calm stability. Born in 1980 in a small town in Norway, she grew up in a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other. Her childhood was spent in a modest home with her parents and siblings, who described her as compassionate, hardworking, and independent from a young age. She excelled in school, and by her late 20s had carved out a successful career in social work. Her colleagues admired her dedication to helping those in need, particularly vulnerable women and children. But as she built her professional life, her personal relationships took a different turn. In 2010, she married a man named Harold, someone who was initially seen as supportive and caring. Their relationship was marked by long stretches of harmony, but beneath that lay moments of tension that few outside the couple witnessed. Friends later recounted that Lagertha rarely spoke of her problems, choosing instead to put on a brave face for the world. Yet those close to her noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. Over time, her once bright spirit seemed dimmed, weighed down by something unknown. Despite her success at work, those who knew her began to notice a shift in her private life. Though she appeared happy, close friends recall instances where Lagertha seemed distant, avoiding conversations about her marriage. Over time, it became clear that the relationship was more complex than it appeared. Harold, who had initially been described as charming and supportive, was rumored to have a volatile side. Friends would later describe how Lagertha seemed increasingly withdrawn, as if carrying a burden she could not share. Then there was the growing tension in her marriage. In the years leading up to her death, neighbors and friends began to see less of Harold. He traveled frequently for work, leaving Lagertha to care for their 2 children. It was during these times that she seemed most at ease, free from whatever strain had been looming over their relationship. But as weeks turned into months, Lagertha confided in close friends that her marriage had grown strained. They spoke of late-night arguments, strained phone calls, and periods of silence that left Lagertha feeling isolated. Yet, she remained committed to her family. Her children were the center of her life, and those who knew her well said she would have done anything to protect them. But the cracks in her marriage were undeniable, and eventually these tensions would become central to the investigation of her death. Lagertha's friends, especially her closest confidants, would later recall that she had mentioned feeling threatened. While no direct threats had ever been reported to the police, there was an undercurrent of fear in her final months. Friends say she grew more anxious, hesitant to talk about what was happening at home. But outwardly, Lagertha tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, focusing on her children and her work. Then in early January of 2018, Lagertha's demeanor changed. Colleagues noticed she seemed distracted, often lost in thought, as if waiting for something to happen. She had confided in one close friend that she was planning to take a trip with the children away from Harold. But that trip would never happen. Just days before her death, Lagertha had reached out to a lawyer, seeking advice on a possible separation. Those closest to her believed this decision may have sealed her fate. As the investigation unfolded, detectives began to focus on those closest to Lagertha. Harold, her husband, became a person of interest early in the case. His behavior following the discovery of her body raised suspicions, particularly as more details about their marriage came to light. He was described by those who knew him as an outgoing man, charismatic in public, but prone to sudden mood swings in private. Investigators would soon uncover a pattern of behavior that suggested a more complicated relationship than anyone had realized. The investigation into Lagertha's death began on the cold morning of January 14, 2018. Police were summoned to her suburban home in the early hours by a concerned neighbor, who noticed the front door slightly ajar and no signs of movement inside. When officers arrived, they found Lagertha lying motionless in the living room, a scene that would soon become central to one of the most complex investigations in recent years. At first glance, there was no obvious sign of forced entry. The door was unlocked, and no windows appeared to be broken. This immediately led investigators to believe that Lagertha may have known her killer. Inside, the living room showed minimal signs of a struggle, nothing appeared out of place, and no valuables were missing. However, a closer examination revealed bruises on Lagertha's wrists, but the lack of clear signs of a break-in or struggle left detectives puzzled. Why would someone so brutally kill Lagertha and yet leave behind no obvious trail? The early stages of the investigation were marked by uncertainty, with detectives piecing together fragments of Lagertha's final hours. As investigators dug deeper, they turned to Lagertha's phone records and email correspondence. It was here that they made their first break through a series of mysterious emails that had been sent to Lagertha over the previous month. The messages were brief, cryptic, and all signed with the name the Devil. The content was disturbing, referencing moments from Lagertha's past that only someone close to her could have known. At first, detectives believed these emails could be the work of a stalker. But the tone of the messages and their timing led investigators to a more unsettling conclusion. Cyber experts worked quickly to trace the source of these emails. They found that the messages had been sent from a disposable email address, created just weeks before Lagertha's death. But even more chilling was the discovery that the emails had been sent from within the vicinity of Lagertha's home. The proximity of the sender suggested that the individual behind these threats had been watching her closely, possibly for some time. Detectives now faced the difficult task of narrowing down their list of suspects, focusing on those who had both access to Lagertha's personal life and the technical ability to disguise their digital footprint. As the investigation progressed, a second piece of evidence surfaced: security camera footage from a nearby convenience store. The footage showed a man dressed in dark clothing entering the store just hours before Lagertha's death. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but what caught investigators' attention was the way he interacted with the cashier. He made a point of paying in cash and kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with the store's cameras. Detectives combed through the footage, hoping to identify the man seen in the video, but their efforts proved fruitless. No one recognized him, and there were no records of a vehicle outside the store matching the time frame. With little to go on, Investigators widened their search, focusing on anyone in Lagertha's life who had the means and the motive to send the threatening emails and carry out such a calculated act. Harold, Lagertha's husband, was the first person they questioned extensively. Harold was cooperative at first, providing what seemed to be a solid alibi. He had been on a business trip at the time of the murder, a fact corroborated by hotel records and phone logs. Yet something about Harold's demeanor during questioning raised suspicion. Investigators later discovered that Harold had returned to town briefly the night before Lagertha's death, a detail he had neglected to mention during initial interviews. With this new information, detectives began building a case against Harold. They retrieved phone records, surveillance footage, and interviewed those who had interacted with him in the days leading up to Lagertha's death. The more they dug, the more inconsistencies they found. And yet, despite these discoveries, there was still no physical evidence directly linking Harold to the crime. Months passed, and the case seemed to stall. With no concrete evidence, investigators found themselves at a crossroads. But then, a new lead emerged. A former friend of Harold's came forward, claiming to have overheard a conversation in which Harold spoke about wanting to leave Lagertha. The friend also mentioned that Harold had been acting strangely in the weeks before the murder, expressing frustration with his marriage and hinting at plans to solve his problems once and for all. This testimony, while circumstantial, added another layer of suspicion to Harold's involvement. As the investigation into Lagertha's death progressed, detectives began assembling a list of suspects, starting with those closest to her. The first person they turned to was Harold, her estranged husband. Although their relationship had been strained for months, Harold had always been perceived as calm and rational by those around them. But behind closed doors, their marriage had been unraveling for years, marked by accusations of infidelity. His aloof demeanor during interviews raised eyebrows, and there were inconsistencies in his story about where he had been the night of the murder. He claimed he was out of town on business, but surveillance footage from a local gas station captured his car pulling into town just hours before Lagertha was found dead. Harold's alibi seemed airtight at first. Hotel records, phone logs, and flight details all supported his claim. Yet, despite this evidence, investigators couldn't shake the feeling that Harold knew more than he was letting on. They looked into his financial history and uncovered mounting debts that had been causing significant strain on the couple. But financial desperation had pushed him over the edge. But Harold wasn't the only person with a motive. As detectives expanded their search, another figure emerged, an old friend of Lagertha's who had recently reconnected with her. This individual, who had known Lagertha since childhood, had a history of mental health issues and had recently sent her a series of erratic messages. In these messages, he spoke of past events with an eerie intensity, hinting at unresolved feelings of resentment. Some wondered if this old friend had been nursing a grudge for years. Investigators quickly brought the friend in for questioning. While his behavior was erratic and unsettling, he vehemently denied any involvement in the crime. He told police that while he had been struggling with his mental health, he had nothing but love for Lagertha and would never hurt her. Detectives weren't convinced, but without concrete evidence linking him to the murder, they were forced to move on. Another theory began to circulate, one that suggested Lagertha's murder wasn't personal at all. Some speculated that she may have been the victim of a stalker. While she had never reported feeling threatened, a few close friends recalled moments when she mentioned being followed or receiving strange phone calls late at night. Could someone have been watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike? Police began tracing the mysterious calls, hoping they would lead to a new suspect. The calls came from disposable phones. Some began to wonder if Lagertha had been targeted by individuals who believed they were acting under supernatural influence. Law enforcement quickly dismissed the idea of supernatural involvement, but the theory persisted in the minds of some members of the public. As investigators continued to sift through the evidence, they remained focused on more grounded explanations, examining everyone in Lagertha's life with renewed scrutiny. Months after Lagertha's tragic death, following intense investigations and a growing list of suspects, the authorities finally made an arrest. The man at the center of the case was none other than Harold, her estranged husband. His arrest shocked the small town, sending ripples through the community that had already been rattled by the crime. For the detectives who had tirelessly worked the case, it seemed like the investigation had reached its conclusion. Yet the arrest was only the beginning. The legal battle that would unfold in the coming months revealed complexities no one had anticipated. From the very beginning, Harold's defense team painted a picture of act of violence. Instead, they suggested that her death had been a tragic accident, possibly linked to a struggle. They also hinted at deeper, more troubling aspects of Lagertha's personal life, questioning whether outside forces had played a role in her demise. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when the defense presented an alternative theory. They claimed that Lagertha had been involved in dangerous and unorthodox practices. While many in the courtroom dismissed this as a far-fetched attempt to shift blame, it left the jury with questions. What exactly had Lagertha been doing in the weeks leading up to her death? And could her associations have played a role? Despite the defense's attempts to steer the narrative, the prosecution remained steadfast. They laid out the evidence that pointed directly to Harald, highlighting the financial pressures he had faced, the mounting debts that had become a source of constant tension between him and Lagertha. With no other clear suspects, they argued that Harald had both the motive and the opportunity to commit the crime. As the trial unfolded, there were moments when it seemed like the case could swing either way. Testimonies from friends and family added emotional weight to the proceedings, while forensic experts broke down the physical evidence in painstaking detail. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when digital forensic analysts presented a series of damning emails communications between Harald and a mysterious acquaintance that hinted at a premeditated plan. While the prosecution's case seemed strong, the defense fought back, casting doubt on the reliability of some of the evidence. They questioned the authenticity of the emails, claiming they could have been fabricated or misinterpreted. Furthermore, they brought in their own forensic experts to challenge the prosecution's timeline of events. As the trial dragged on, the emotional toll on Lagertha's family became more apparent. Her parents, siblings, and close friends attended every hearing, their faces etched with grief and determination. For them, the trial wasn't just about seeking justice, it was about finding closure for a loss that had shaken them to their core. As the closing arguments were made, both sides left the jury with difficult decisions. The prosecution emphasized the motive, the evidence, and the tragic end to a once promising life. The defense, however, urged the jury to consider reasonable doubt, suggesting that the case was far from open and shut. The stage was set for a verdict that would either deliver justice or leave the case with more questions than answers. The world waited as the jury deliberated, their decision poised to impact not only the accused but an entire community that had been left reeling in the wake of Lagertha's tragic death. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and emotional witness statements, the jury returned with their verdict. The room fell silent as the decision was read aloud. It had been a trial marked by twists, turns, and a relentless pursuit for the truth. Now it all came down to this single moment. The jury found Harald guilty of second-degree murder. As the verdict was announced, emotions erupted across the courtroom. Lagertha's family held each other tightly, tears streaming down their faces. But for Harald's supporters, the verdict was met with disbelief. While the legal process had reached its conclusion, for many the emotional toll of the case was far from over. Lagertha's death left an indelible mark not just on her family, but on the community at large. The town, once a peaceful place where everyone knew one another, now found itself grappling with the horrifying reality of what had unfolded. For those who loved Lagertha, the verdict provided some closure, but questions still lingered. Was Harald truly the mastermind behind her death, or had the court overlooked other crucial elements of the case? For many of her closest friends, there were whispers of doubt, of unanswered questions about her final days, and what might have really transpired behind closed doors. As Harald was led away in handcuffs, he maintained his innocence, never wavering from his claim that he was not responsible for Lagertha's death. His defense team immediately filed an appeal, seeking to overturn the conviction. Meanwhile, Lagertha's family continued to search for peace, though the void left by her death would never truly be filled. Outside the courtroom, the public's reaction was mixed. While some celebrated the conviction as justice served, others remained skeptical. Conspiracy theories began to emerge, with some arguing that Lagertha had been involved in something far more complex than a simple domestic dispute. The media, too, continued to speculate, feeding into the ongoing mystery surrounding her death. For Lagertha's family, however, no amount of public speculation could change the reality of their loss. In the months following the trial, they focused on preserving her memory, establishing a foundation in her name, working to ensure that her life, and not just her tragic death, would be remembered. Though the trial is over and justice, in the eyes of the law, has been served, the legacy of Lagertha's life and death continues to reverberate. Her story remains a haunting reminder that even the most seemingly ordinary lives can harbor extraordinary mysteries. Lagertha's story is one that refuses to fade, etched into the collective memory of all who knew her and those who followed the investigation. Her life, filled with moments of joy and struggle, now stands overshadowed by the questions left in the wake of her death. As the trial concludes and the courtroom doors close, what lingers are not just the facts of the case. There remains a deeper search for understanding. What led to this tragic encounter? Could it have been prevented? Was there something lurking beneath the surface of everyday life that no one could see? The case of Lagertha's death touches on broader themes about the nature of trust, the darkness that can sometimes exist in relationships, and the danger of ignoring warning signs. For some, her death brings forth uncomfortable questions about the nature of evil, whether it lies within us or comes from something outside our understanding. For those who loved her, Lagertha's memory is not defined by her death, but by the life she lived, her laughter, her resilience, her moments of joy. And yet, her murder forces us to confront difficult truths. How do we recognize danger in the people closest to us? Can we ever truly know the depth of another person's soul? In this case, as in so many others, the line between light and dark, trust and fear, remains blurred. Even as we leave the courtroom and return to our lives, the case of Lagertha leaves us with unsettling questions. For some, her death is a reminder that no matter how much we search for answers, some truths may remain forever beyond our reach. Lagertha reminds us that even in the most ordinary lives, tragedy can strike without warning. And while we may never fully understand the reasons behind her death, we are left with the echoes of her life, a legacy of love, loss, and unanswered questions.